Hello, Aurora lovers. I'm DaleBoan from DaleBoan Imaging, and this is Aurora Hunting 101. This is episode 19, How Do I Photograph the Aurora? There's two common ways of photographing the aurora. The easiest is to use a cell phone, and that's usually the starting point with modern cell phones. And the second is to use a larger camera, a digital SLR, a mirrorless camera. Let's explore those two options further. I've done a number of presentations on photographing the northern lights, so I have a convenient PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to use that. So as I said, the two most common ways of photographing the northern lights are the convenient one, which is cell phones, which do a reasonable job and are getting better every day or every year, or the bigger digital SLR or mirrorless cameras, which are the DLSR replacements, and they are capable of creating better pictures of the northern lights in most situations. For cell phones, most recent high-end cell phones have a night mode, or failing that, they have a manual mode, and you can use that to take pictures of the northern lights. Night mode is pretty much automatic, I believe, in most cases. Manual modes, you'd want to set the aperture to the lowest f number possible, and the longest time possible, and the highest ISO possible. Certainly as a starting point, that will probably give you the biggest or the best bright picture of the aurora. Sometimes you can set the focus. If you set that to infinity, that would be the correct setting as well. Some of the older phones have trouble focusing at night, just as the other cameras, the digital SLR cameras, have trouble focusing at night. If you have a tripod or stand, or you can put the camera someplace rather than holding it, that will usually create a better picture. Now, in terms of actual settings and how to do it, the problem is with cell phones, each manufacturer has their own camera app, and they all work in slightly different ways, so it's really hard to say exactly how to do it. In general, you can talk about a specific camera, but this is a general talk, so I can't say too much more about cell phones. You can always Google your particular cell phone. So this is a cell phone picture taken a few years ago with a fairly old camera, Samsung Galaxy 9. I think we're at Galaxy 23, and they sort of skipped 10 and went straight to 20. So it's probably at least 5 years old. And this was done manually, so f1.5, 10 seconds exposure, and then ISO 320, which is, I believe, about the maximum for that camera. But you got the aurora, you got the clouds, you got the reflection on the water. It's not too bad. I tried editing it. I don't think that I necessarily improved it. It looks kind of unnatural to me, and it's a lot noisier. You can see the digital noise in the picture. This is from my current camera, which is a Pixel 6, which is already about a generation and a half old. They're talking about the Pixel 8. Maybe it's going to come out this fall. This was shot using night sight, which is the night photography mode. If you look at the picture file, it says it was f1.9, which might be true, a third of a second, which I don't believe is true, and ISO 19,097, which is a really strange number. Maybe it's some other information embedded in the ISO, I don't know, but I don't really trust that as a real ISO number. And then I edited it slightly to make the dimmer parts a little bit darker to give it a bit more contrast. Moving on from cell phone cameras, the next step is digital SLR, or its follow-on mirrorless cameras, and they have much larger sensors, and usually the lenses can collect much more light, and that produces better photos. They are also more complicated, especially if you're going to use them manually. And generally we do need to use them in manual modes at night. First, most people start with a camera, but you also need some other things. You need to use a tripod because we're talking about long exposures, and we need to keep the camera stable. And tripods don't need to be crazy expensive, but they should be solid. You don't want them to vibrate. Some of the plastic ones are pretty shaky. Maybe an inexpensive metal one would be a good starting point. I had one of those for years. And even if your tripod is pretty stable, it's good to not just push the shutter button and have it take a picture, because just tapping the shutter button can cause the camera and tripod to shake. To work around that, you can use a 2-second timer by setting the timer mode on the camera. You can also use a remote shutter release, and depends on the camera, there's a couple options there. Sometimes it's a button with the cable connected to the camera. You have to be careful that the cable doesn't move around and shake the camera. Sometimes it's an infrared button, or you can use a phone app and control the camera remotely if the camera supports that. The other thing you need is the lens, and in many ways, the lens is more important than the camera itself. If you have a good lens on a really old camera, you will get a better picture than a bad lens on a new camera. And in photography jargon, you want a fast wide-angle lens that is wide open. So for maybe explain that in a little more normal language. So fast refers to how fast you can take the picture. And that's a effect of how much light can enter the lens. So fast lenses have low f numbers, and for some reason, well, I know why, but historic reasons, f numbers, the smaller they are, the faster the lens is, the more light they let in. So a relatively fast lens is f2.8. A kit lens that you might get when you buy a camera as a kit might be f5.6 or maybe f4 in a few cases. And they do get faster than that. I do have I believe an f1.4 lens. There are some that go to f1.2, and even Nikon has a f0.95 lens, which is really expensive and just a manual lens. But so if you have a slower lens with a higher f number, you need to compensate for that with a longer exposure and higher ISO. And wide open just means lenses you can, the term is stop them down. So an f2.8 lens, you can change it so there's a diaphragm that closes, that blocks out some of the light inside the lens, and you can make it act like an f4 lens or an f5.6 lens or an f22 lens. That gives you different effects because of stopping it down, but that makes it slower. So when we're trying to do a picture at night, we want it to be wide open. We don't want that diaphragm to be closed. We want it to be open. We want the f28 to be set to f28. And then wide angle is just how wide a view the lens captures. And that's measured in millimeters, and the smaller the millimeters, the wider angle it is. I use a 15 to 30 millimeter lens a lot of the time. 15 millimeters is the one, it's a zoom lens, so that's where in the zoom that I capture the largest part of the sky, and then when I switch it to 30, it's only capturing a smaller part. There are wider angle lenses than that. There's 14-12. There are some, I believe, 8mm, which are fisheye lenses that can see the entire sky. Sometimes people take pictures of the aurora with them, but most people are using a little bit longer lenses. So long in terms of, that's actually the sort of the length of the lens, or at least the length of the optical path in the lens. And the shorter it is, the wider angle the lens can see. If you think of a telescope, that is a very long lens, and it can only see a few stars, for example, a very small section of the sky. So, as I said, the auto mode doesn't work very well at night when it's dark. The cameras are getting better, but in general, you want more control at night, so you actually set the mode to manual. Mode usually has a number of settings. They range from everything from sport to automatic, full automatic, program mode, which is partially automatic. But we want to set it to manual, which is usually M for the mode. That's either a dial or somewhere in the settings in the menu. ISO is how sensitive the camera is to the light. That goes back to the film days where higher ISO number meant that the film was more sensitive to light. And in a camera, the equivalent is it's got more amplification of what's being recorded by the sensor in the camera. And digital cameras can have quite high ISOs compared to what film could do. But we want to set that to an automatic or to a fixed value, so it doesn't change automatically. And manual mode will do that. Shutter speed there's three things: ISO, shutter speed, and aperture are the sort of three things that control most about a picture. Shutter speed is how long we're taking the picture. And during the daylight, that's 1/100th of a second, 200th of a second. At night, it's several seconds to tens of seconds. Most cameras can easily go up to 30 seconds. Aperture is that F number. It's how wide open that lens is that you have. So again, we wanted that to be the smallest number of whatever your lens is capable. Focus, we want to manually focus. We want to turn off automatic focusing. Usually that is a switch on the lens, or it might be a setting in the menu. We want to turn off image stabilization. I say maybe or probably. The newer the lens is and the newer the camera is, the less likely that is absolutely necessary, but every once in a while, the stabilization, when it's sitting on a tripod, starts hunting a little bit and blurs the image because it thinks it should be trying to stabilize and it's not, I think is what happens. Some lenses manage to detect that and you don't really have that effect, but if you want to be safe, you turn it off. And some camera bodies have in-body stabilization, and you probably want to turn that off as well, just as best practice. If your lens has any filters on it, you should remove those. Some people put on UV filters as a protection filter. Some people have circular polarizers, filters on the lenses. Those cut out a lot of light, and they will create distortion patterns in your image at night. So you want to get rid of those. And the last is color temperature. It's sort of least important, but it has a pretty significant effect on your image, especially if you're just using JPEG straight out of the camera. It's less important if you're shooting RAW. And what RAW means is, let me back up. When your camera takes a picture, it takes information off a sensor, processes it into a RAW. It compresses some of the information to make that RAW file smaller, and it also changes the colors and contrast and does some other things to make it look a little bit more realistic than what comes straight off the sensor. You can also have the camera record that raw sensor information, in which case you're responsible for doing that transformation that the camera did to get to a JPEG using a photo editor. But there is more information there, and that's really important when you're taking photographs at night. Some of that really dark detail gets stripped out when the JPEG gets compressed. So most night photographers use RAW files. A lot of professional photographers use RAW files. And you can't tell a camera to record both. You can say RAW or JPEG or both. And which one you want to use is really up to you. But the RAW is the one that you can change the most. And in terms of color temperature, this is really only important for the JPEGs, because the RAW will show up with whatever color temperature you suggested, but you can change it to whatever you want. The JPEGs you can change as well, but it's a little bit harder and may not work as well. So some people like to use tungsten color temperature for Aurora, which gives Aurora a sort of bluey green color, but it does tend to turn the sky a bit blue as well. So to give you an idea of how much color temperature can affect the photograph. So this was originally just a photograph of the auroral oval low in the horizon, and it was a single color. So what I've done is gone in and changed the color temperature from a blue, a cooler color on the left, to a warmer color temperature on the right. And you can see on the left side, the aurora is maybe a little bit more blue-green, and the upper layer is more magenta than the red on the other side. But you also see that the sky and the snow is also shifted blue. So you could go and edit those separately, but if you want to shift to the cooler, that tungsten color temperature is about 4,000 Kelvin, I think, somewhere in there, or maybe 3,000 Kelvin. The range goes from about 3,000 to 7 or 8 or 9,000 for the really yellow to red ones, yellow and red aurora on the right side. So if you look from the blue side on the left, if you look closer to the middle, the snow looks more natural. It looks like closer to a white color, and the sky looks fairly black. And then if you move over to the right side, maybe going a bit too far there, but even the sky is starting to turn a bit red, and so is the snow. So what colors you like in your aurora is now you're starting to get into artistic decisions, right? What do you think will look good for your picture? So going back to autofocus, it usually does not work particularly well. Again, that's something that has been improving. My Canon R5 actually focuses on bright stars fairly well. But I don't really trust it. I tend to use manual focus, and I think I can get slightly better focus manually than it will get automatically. It gets pretty close though, but I want better. And some cameras really, really struggle. And then you might think that you can just turn the lens all the way to infinity, and that would give you focus for the stars. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. Most lenses can turn past infinity for two things. One, the autofocus system often goes past infinity and then comes back a little bit. And two, that infinity focus point changes if it's a zoom lens as you zoom. So doing it that way doesn't work. The most common ways of doing this in terms of manual techniques, is to point the camera at a star or the moon or a planet, or say a bright farm light or radio tower light or something that you can zoom in. So you use live view on the back of the camera, and then you push the zoom button to zoom the display, pick a light source and try and make that as small as possible. Pick something towards the middle of the image rather than right at the edges, because a lot of these fast wide angle lenses have some amount of distortion out towards the edge of the lenses. It may not be really noticeable, but it'll be more noticeable when you zoom in. It'll be harder to get that zoom accurate. If you can't do that, you can often light up a distant subject with a flashlight, house, car, tree. You can have a person walk away from you with light and shine light on themselves. Just something that's far enough away that it's effectively in infinity for your lens. And failing that, it's possible to know where infinity is on your lens. That can change as you zoom. I did have a lens that I knew that. I usually don't trust it. It's better to check since you have live view. But, you could focus it during the day and see where it is on the markings, and maybe mark that on your lens. And then at night you can use that marking and avoid the other techniques. And then, as I said, the zoom lenses, when you zoom, it changes the focus point on almost all lenses. So if you change the zoom, you do need to go back and refocus. Here's an example of an oops. Went to this waterfall, jumped out of the car, set up my camera, took the picture. Didn't take very many pictures because I wanted to go someplace else. I really like this picture, but it's out of focus. It's unusable. And I never thought to, I was rushing, didn't think to check the focus. It's very disappointing. So it happens to everybody. In terms of actual camera settings, when you're going to photograph the Aurora, Aurora vary in brightness considerably. So you're going to do long exposure in seconds, and it can be anywhere from a few seconds to tens of seconds, depending on the brightness. So usually the Aurora is dimmest on the horizon because it is actually physically further away from you. And when it's overhead, you are the closest to it, and there's less atmosphere in the way. Conveniently, brighter Aurora, where you can use shorter exposures, move more. Since you're using a shorter exposure, you can capture the more detail rather than having it blurred by the motion. And when you're checking your exposure, don't trust the display on the back of the camera. It's at night. Even if you turn down the brightness of your display, your eyes have adjusted to the dark, and your camera is going to look really bright, and the pictures on the back of the camera are going to appear to be much brighter than they really are. And when you get home or look at them under, normal light or on your computer, they're going to be a lot dimmer than you expect. So you need to look at the histogram, and I'll come back to that. In terms of ISO, how sensitive you want the sensor to be, ISO 800 for the brighter one to 6400 for the really dim one. Now, most cameras have sort of a maximum usable ISO. The more recent ones, like my Canon R5, I can go 4000 to 6400, 6400 ISO. My previous one, much more than 32,000 was pushing it, and the one before was 16,000. So if you have a maybe older camera, or I usually have fairly high-end cameras, So if you have an older camera with older sensor technology and older processors, you might be a little bit limited, but most of them can certainly go to 1600 now and probably closer to 3200 without introducing a bunch of noise, digital noise into the picture. So start with ISO 3200, 20 seconds, and then the lens's lowest f-stop for dim Aurora. And then for brighter ones, try ISO 800 to 1600, 1 to 10 seconds for bright Aurora. We want to bring down the shutter exposure. We want to bring down this exposure time faster than we bring down the ISO. At ISO 800, there probably won't be a whole lot of noise, but it's more important to try and capture the detail when the Aurora is active and moving quite a bit. So we want to use shorter exposures in those cases. How to read your histogram. So the histogram is a graph, and most cameras you can display the histogram. It might be buried in the menu a little bit, but you can always Google it for your camera. So on the left side, on the left side, it's all the pixels in the picture that are totally black, and on the right side, it's all the pictures that are totally white. And then the various shades of gray are in the middle. There are also red, green, blue versions of the histogram that show each of the primary colors, but they're pretty similar. You know, if you're outside a green field and a blue sky, the blues will be noticeably brighter than maybe the green grass. As I said, check your exposure using the histogram at night. And there is an idea of exposed to the right. So you don't want, if you take a picture at night and the histogram shows everything on the right side, where in the blacks, you probably want to increase the ISO or the exposure time to try and shift your image to be exposed, not in the center, but further to the right, so it's not right on the edge. That will almost always give you a better image than trying to fix it later in a photo editor. It's always better to create a better image in camera than it is to try and fix it later. So this is an example histogram. This looks like I think this is off of either Lightroom or Photoshop. They also have histograms, so you can see blacks on the left and whites on the right side, and then shadows, middle tones, and highlights from left to right. So just looking at this picture, I can say that it's a little bit dark. So there's a lot of shadows and darker mid-tones in it. That's where that big hump there, that's a lot of the image. And then in terms of highlights, there's not a lot of highlights. So it's, probably not a lot of sky or something in it. And the blacks, it basically goes to zero once you hit pure black and cuts off whites even before I get to pure white, which is always a good idea. And then if you are taking a picture that's underexposed, you can see it's very, all the darks are really, really dark, maybe completely black. And you can see in the histogram that there's that big white spike right along on the right side. That's that's a good indication that it's too dark, and it looks like the blacks are being completely cut off. That the other side of that spike is missing, so all of that information is just going to be black, regardless of what you try to do in an editor. In the middle, you're back to similar to that other histogram. You see you got that little bit of a blue spike from the sky. But both the blacks and the whites are pretty well balanced, and everything's not clipping on the edge and then overexposed. And you're probably not going to run into that at night. But you can see that not as bad as the underexposed, but you can see that it's bumping against the pure whites, and maybe there's some pixels that are completely pure white. And again, you can't fix that in an editor. So that's mostly it in terms of settings and techniques. I should say that that dim Aurora and the Milky Way are have pretty much identical settings. So you can use that dim Aurora settings for the Milky Way if you're interested in that. And sometimes people take pictures of both and get them in the same picture. So beyond that, if you're going out for your first time and you're not particularly experienced at doing pictures at night, by all means, focus on the settings and how to use a camera at night. Don't worry about anything else. Get a picture of the Aurora first. Doesn't matter if there's power lines in the way, there's, I don't know, fence posts and signs, and that doesn't matter. Buildings, whatever. Get a picture. And then, once you are comfortable getting a good exposure of the northern lights, now we're trying to create a good photograph. So in that case, all the normal rules of composition apply. Even if you just started in photography, a lot of people have heard of rules of thirds as one of the basic rules of composition, where you have vertical and horizontal is often split into thirds. Now you don't always have to follow that, but it's a good starting point. So the goal is to create a good landscape photograph that's taken at night and obviously has Aurora in it. So a couple pictures of mine. So I was at this church. It was about 2 hours away, and I sort of gambled that, I knew the moon was going to be out, so there's a good chance that I might have trouble seeing the Aurora with a nearly full moon. And so I went there, waited. Not much happened. There was some activity, but I couldn't really see it very well, or photograph it very well. So I left, went down the road to another spot, and the Aurora's activity shot up. So I drove back to the church, and by the time I had set up my camera, it had disappeared again. So I hung around for a while, not as long, but I eventually gave up, drove away, and as I was driving away, it popped back up again. So I came back, set up my camera really quick, and it's a decent picture. But I would say, in terms of rules of third, there's not enough snow, and the land is too low, and I got enough room, maybe more room at the top than I need than at the bottom. So the whole thing should have been shifted up a little bit more. But, that's one of the difficulties of working really fast at night in the dark. Sometimes you miss a little bit. This is Lake Minnewaca in Banff National Park near the town of Banff. So we got some rocks in the foreground. So we got a foreground and midground. We've got the mountains and the Aurora above it in the distance. This is a different color temperature, right? We've got a more red-yellow look to the Aurora, which to some people maybe doesn't look as natural. But I find that Aurora that's low on the horizon tends to be more yellow, I think for the same reason that the moon and the sun get yellow and orange when they're near the horizon. The light is passing through more atmosphere. Not as much for the Aurora, because the Aurora is within the Earth's atmosphere, but still it's hundreds of kilometers away in this case. This is an HDR picture. There's an awful lot of foreground right there, but I wasn't going to go out on the river in winter by myself. It's very not safe. Definitely not safe. It's very light polluted. It's very hard to pull the aurora out of the very polluted night sky. This is a much more natural picture. Might even be slightly panorama. A fairly big church with the aurora towering over it. That church is actually looking west instead of north, and then much of the picture is to this, east, and much of the picture is to the southeast. I like this composition a bit better. The steeple sort of on the left, or on the right side of the thirds, and the foreground sort of thirds, and you got aurora, and then just plain sky above. And then I managed to, I had access to the church, so I could turn on the lights and have light spill from the interior and the windows lit up. This is a selfie, more natural picture. The color of the aurora bothers me a little bit in this one because I like it a little more greener, but this was the way I ended up processing it. So that's some examples of, thinking about composition in addition to the challenge of capturing aurora. So as you can see, the two most common ways are to use either a cell phone to take pictures, in which case most cameras nowadays you could just put it in auto night mode and it'll take a picture. Failing that, you might have a manual mode that you can set it to. Last several generations of cell phones can take some sort of picture of the aurora. Newer ones are better, and every generation they get better. And then beyond that is the interchangeable lens systems, the digital SLRs or the mirrorless cameras, where you can change the lenses. And we're looking for fast, small f number lenses that are fairly short to get a wide angle, like low in terms of millimeters. I use 15, there's 14 and 12. I've got a 12 millimeter lens as well. So that gives you a wider view of the sky. Fisheye lenses that can see almost the entire sky are about 8 millimeters or 12 millimeters, depending on how much of the sensor they cover. And those allow us to take more or better pictures of the northern lights and more of the sky, but it does take a little bit more skill to use them, and you may want to be able to do some photo editing. Not necessarily, you can just take JPEGs straight off the camera and use those, but editing helps you adjust them to be the way you want them to look as opposed to what the camera decides they should look like. With that, please check out episode 20, which is, for the 20th one, I'm going to do a Aurora hunting crash course, sort of summarizing a lot of what I've covered in the last 19 episodes. So I look forward to that. So I'm wishing you clear skies and happy hunting.